Welcome to the Data Room, where we share best practices and actionable tips on being a data-driven company, or as we call it, data first. If you're a B2B revenue leader looking to scale your growth stage business, come and join experienced CEO and tech founder Scott Stouffer in the Data Room. Welcome to another episode of the Data Room. I am Heather Kitos here with Scale Matters CEO and co-founder Scott Stouffer. Scott, thanks for joining us today. There's a hot button issue or a hot topic going on from revenue leaders and from marketing leaders of multi-touch attribution. I believe it's a very sore subject for many revenue marketing leaders currently because they're looking to get a really specific idea of their pipeline success. I've seen a lot of discussions firsthand just lately around, what attribution model to use, what to do about like non-attributed activities like brand building or Slack communities, and what tools should we use to help with all of that. Scott, I'd love to hear from your opinion and experience. Multi-touch attribution reporting is kind of this gray area. What are the most common problems with it?
Wow, it's a great topic. It's an area where I think a ton of effort is being expended by marketing organizations that is completely non-productive, and it's largely a distraction from things they should be focused on that really could make a difference. So let's start with maybe discussing what the goals of multi-touch attribution might be, and I think there are three. The first goal, which I think is probably the most valuable reason to attempt attribution, is to understand which investments in which assets are the most productive for driving growth and which ones are the least productive, so that marketing leaders can, better funnel their resources to the things that seem to be most productive. The second goal, which is also admirable, is the notion that if you can determine that a particular pattern of engagement with your prospects is more likely to result in a sale, well, then you can likely take intentional actions to try to maximize that particular motion. But in this case, it's not just marketing multi-touch. You need to look at all touches, including the sales touches, et cetera. As a very simple example, if we determine that we are more likely to close a prospect who participated in a data maturity assessment and who also sat through a webinar on tips for increasing the integrity of their go-to-market data than prospects who either didn't do either or only did one, then we can take steps to intentionally ensure that motion, which of course should then increase our overall win rate. So that's a useful goal. The third goal of multi-touch attribution, which I personally find to be completely destructive, is to measure so-called marketing influence on revenue. In essence, it is marketing leadership's attempt to claim some quantifiable credit for revenue. And in all the companies that I've seen where there's energy going towards this goal, it really feels to me that it's destructive because it actually increases misalignment between the sales and marketing functions, causes arguments, debates. It's not helpful. Not to mention that the methods of calculating or attempting to infer influence are completely arbitrary anyway. You said, people talking about which attribution models to use. Yeah, because you're just picking one arbitrarily, right? I mean, it just doesn't prove anything. So the data is just meaningless, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I think a good question to ask ourselves is, why is it even important to measure marketing influence? Do we try to measure influence from the product team? Not really. Many people might say that product deserves most of the credit because without them, you wouldn't have any revenue. But taking credit isn't what this should all be about. Everything should be about how do we collectively get better, and not about how do we assign credit to various functions. So I think this whole measurement of marketing influence as a goal is damaging to companies. And I think the more sophisticated people that looked at attribution, multi-touch attribution when it first came out, sort of have gotten to the point of realizing it's not really telling us anything. And the more we try to scientifically engineer it. We're just creating more sophisticated arbitrariness, if you will. So the most sophisticated marketers have largely moved on from that. Anyways, let's just ignore that third goal of marketing measuring marketing influence, because it really doesn't have any redeeming value. And let's instead focus on the first two. The ability to do multi-touch attribution in a way that helps marketing understand which of their investments are the most productive and helps the overall go-to-market team understand if there are preferred cadences of engagement that increase the likelihood of success. I think the first thing to dispel, at least for growth stage B2B companies, is that you can actually measure influence. So if you consider influence in this context to be the change in a prospective buyer's mind that moves them closer towards your company and your offerings, then there is no technology I know of that can actually measure when and how people's minds are changed. The best way by far is to actually ask the buyer what has influenced them. But the reliability of their answer is very correlated to the length of a sales cycle. For example, it's pretty reasonable on a transactional sale or maybe a short sales cycle with a cycle time of 1 to 2 weeks to ask a prospect, how'd you hear about us? What other pieces of collateral have you consumed? How did those influence your decision? And if you can collect that data over a large number of prospects, that data should be reasonably significant. But let's think about longer sales cycles, maybe 60, 90 days, or complex enterprise sales cycles of a year and a half. Over the course of longer sales cycles, that information is likely to blur in the head of the buyer. So their ability to recall with any actionable accuracy is pretty much zero, right? Their ability to recall what really influenced them. So one option to deal with that issue is to be very intentional about asking frequently throughout the sales cycle. For example, if you see they opened an email from a drip campaign, the salesperson could simply say in the next conversation, hey, I see you opened that email the other day. What did you think about it? And assuming the buyer says, I don't even know what you're talking about, assuming they can even recall it and they give a legit answer, then there needs to be a systematic way to get this information collected and collated across all of the prospects and presented to marketing in a way that actually tells them something. So in order to do that, you'd really need to rely heavily on some sort of voice of prospect analysis that's derived from conversation intelligence tools and associated analytics tools. And I think the point I'm really trying to make is that for growth stage B2B tech companies, attempting to truly measure influence of any given touch is impossible. And it feels to me like a fool's folly that'll consume a lot of energy and likely lead to poor decisions because the resulting data just isn't going to be reliable. So then I guess my final thought on this then is the only real value that can be gained is by focusing on identifying correlation and correlation between engagement cadences and touches and success. And I think there are some companies out there that are actually going about this, or at least thinking about this in the right way. But here again, there's two tricky issues to getting this right. First is you need to be able to measure what assets are consumed, and this can be very difficult. Clearly, opening an email doesn't actually mean that you read an email. Similarly, attending a webinar doesn't actually mean you paid attention and weren't really, having the webinar off in the background while you're doing your real work and your mind's focused on your real work. So I think it's important for companies to put a lot of thought into, for any of their particular assets that are part of an engagement, how do we measure whether it was actually consumed or not? Secondly, you need to be able to A/B test different engagement cadences. So take my early example where I talked about correlation between high win rate and prospects who had participated in a data maturity assessment and also sat in on a data integrity webinar. But let's say all of those folks also consumed a collateral piece that maybe had 2 case studies on it. So to understand the value of that collateral piece, we'd actually need to exclude it for a while from the cadence and then see if the win rates changed at all. So just because something is in a cadence that seems to be a winner doesn't mean that that particular asset contributed to that. So you need to be very sophisticated and agile in the way that you test these various cadences and assets. So I guess to summarize, forget about measuring influence because it's impossible. Focus on measuring correlation, but understand that to do it right so that it's useful and not misleading, you've really got to put energy into measuring consumption of assets, but also A/B testing different cadences. And my own view here is that this is not for the faint of heart. I think you probably got to be at least a $50 million a year business or higher to be able to afford the level of investment to really have a chance of doing this right. And for what it's worth, I think there is a lot more upside for companies whose marketing organizations put more energy into optimizing around targeting, messaging, and positioning than trying to chase this fool's folly of multi-touch attribution.
Thank you for that hot take, I would say, on multi-touch attribution. I actually really love what you said about just ignoring influence and just focusing on correlation. That's a good, kind of mindset to put yourself in, because at the end of the day, 7% here, 10% here, what does it really matter as long as we're all moving toward the same revenue goal, right? And if that misalignment that you've talked about early on about sales and marketing trying to fight over who's taking credit for what, doesn't really help the business goals at a whole. I'd love to hear your take on the idea of kind of like multi-cycle attribution. And do you think that's a little more accurate in maybe attributing revenue in the goals that you had mentioned that were more important than that third goal?
Yeah, so we use the term multi-cycle attribution, and it's sort of related, but it's also separate. We use the term multi-cycle attribution to distinguish between different unique buying cycles that a prospect might go through. And I think generally this brings up a very important point about what constitutes a sales cycle or a buying cycle. And many organizations do not do a very good job with this. So, for example, let's say in one company, a demo request comes in from an organic SEO form on the website, and we engage with the prospect over the ensuing 2 months maybe, and eventually we move them into pipeline, but we ultimately can't close the deal. So we lost the opportunity. Now, a year later, an eager new hire SDR is prospecting against the contacts in the database and gets the same person to re-engage. And 60 days later, a sale is made. In our view, those are two very distinct and different sales/buying cycles, each on their own that maybe lasted 60 days, but over an elapsed time of maybe 14 months. The first one resulted in a loss. The second one resulted in a win. And in our way of thinking, the first cycle should be attributed from a sourcing strategy to organic SEO. But the second cycle should be attributed to SDR outbound prospecting. But in many companies, during the second go-round, the salesperson would just reopen the original opportunity. And this causes 3 significant problems. First, it causes win rates to be overstated because the original lost opportunity has essentially been erased. Secondly, it causes sales cycle times to be overstated because you're now looking at elapsed time from the original demo request of 14 months instead of the sort of 60 days this recent sales cycle was. But the third thing is it misattributes the revenue to the proper sourcing strategy. For example, in this case, that revenue would show up attributed to inbound SEO, when in our view, in this case, since the real sales cycle that caused the win was an SDR prospecting effort, it should actually be attributed against SDR prospecting. So I think, again, it's related. Attribution is related, but we think it's very important that companies be thoughtful and conscious about what actually is a sale or buy cycle, and then they need to set up their data model and their data integrity protocols to sort of ensure the sanctity of that. Otherwise, they end up with just kind of garbage data because they aren't distinguishing between what is realistically multiple sales cycles.
That's a very good point about just even the way that affected those type of metrics that you would assume drive strategy and the rest of that. And we've talked about this in the past, just putting the data first and letting that data help drive the strategy rather than, like you said, looking at an elapsed sales cycle of 14 months and just assuming that means the sales cycle is on average, 10 months or something like that because this one outlier kind of said otherwise. So that makes a really good point. If you are having any questions or trying to dive more into, maybe multi-touch attribution isn't the craziness that it should be, and maybe we should think about it in a different way. Thinking about your granular data model is definitely one way to do that. And I would encourage you to check out our data maturity assessment at scalematters.com/assessment. So that will help you better understand where you are in your data journey and maybe where you can make some improvements. So check out scalematters.com/assessment. Scott, it's always fun to hear your takes on how reporting has changed and how people are thinking about data. So I appreciate it today. Thanks for joining us in the data room, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Heather.